Do we feel more or less pessimistic about Britain's chances of failure or civil war or whatever we will call it since we last spoke publicly?
Well, not less, but I'm not sure more. But certainly not less. I think we are very obviously on the track that I have described previously over really over the last few years, indeed over the last 10 years, if it's about things that I've written down. But I don't think there's any reason that I can see in the news to feel that there has been some change of course. In most respects, frankly, I think there's an acceleration. Honestly, I've been asked to write a short book on this topic, and each day when I sit down to churn out a few hundred words towards that, I think, well, isn't this all hostage to fortune? By the time I finish this, literally everything um, is going to be obvious. So, in short, I'm certainly not less pessimistic than I have been.
Yeah, I'm going to hazard that you're actually more pessimistic. If you're talking about events are accumulating, that sounds like we should be more pessimistic, or more. Maybe a better way to say it is we're more confirmed in the trends that we've already seen, right? So, yeah. All right, Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, not being a resident of the UK anymore, um, living here in Australia, of course, I'm somewhat removed, and therefore perhaps it behoves me not to conclude too much from 10,000 miles away. But I mean, broadly, I would share David's outlook, and I would add that what to me seems one of the things that is worth sort of thinking about or discussing from the point of view of your question is whether what was perhaps seen in terms of Britain's traditional capacity to absorb and contain and recontain particular political issues is dissipating. So, I mean, as you and David will completely understand, Britain has faced numerous crisis points through its history, but its commitment to a liberal approach to politics over the past couple of hundred years has always enabled those differences and crises to be somehow sorted out one way or another, often through messy compromises, but that's been a kind of British genius for just sort of muddling through, but in a good way. And so I sense that capacity to muddle through in a sort of whatever you want to call it, a mutually accepting way, that you accept that the person with the other point of view has some degree of right on their side or some degree of legitimacy of cause, and can be somehow reconciled in the polity, is dissipating. And so that's just a general sense. And I discern that, as I say, from quite a distance away. But that's one of the things which I think would cause me to think that Britain, and indeed a lot of Europe, is not heading in a good direction.
Yeah. So I'm going to say quickly, in answer to my own question, I think I am more pessimistic, and I think there's reasons to be pessimistic week to week in the current summer of 2025, given how uh, how badly the government is responding to crisis on crisis. It's just not the government, including the administrative state as well as the political administration, just do not seem able to adapt to events and escape their ideological um, path dependency. The protests over asylum hotels are being tackled in the cliched ways of misrepresenting who the protesters are and thinking about where we're going to put the asylum seekers, claimants, whatever you call them, if we're not going to put them in hotels, where we're going to put them, instead of solving the problem of illegal immigration. And that's just one example of a government that just doesn't seem to be able to adjust to the crises of our time. I would like to get to other Western countries' problems. I know David has done this. So we've got David, a Canadian in London. We've got me, a British-born American, speaking to you from America, and Michael, a Briton in Australia. We can talk about other Western countries, but let's set some parameters of what we're talking about. David, I know you've talked about civil war. I've talked about Britain is failing. So I have said that Britain is in a condition of failing, and our current trends, it's going to fail as a nation state, and then usually that ends in civil war.
So I've used the term civil war, which I think is appropriate. I do mean it in a fairly generic sense of a form of war which in which the belligerents were under the same sovereign authority at the outset of the conflict, which, if you accept as a definition, it will include a huge kind of variation of types. And indeed, the history of civil war from one time to another and one place to another has produced many variants of that type. Specifically, what I expect, or the character of the civil war that I see emerging, both in the UK and elsewhere, is one that essentially has two levels that are highly interrelated, but are, for analytical purposes, I think it's important to separate. One of those is essentially an anti-elite revolt, or a conservative revolt, a peasant revolt, something having essentially a revolutionary character, where the native people of the country essentially seek to punish their elite for having pursued policies that have stripped them of their native right to their own country, that have displaced them, and pretty obviously done so, and despite and in the face of demands that they not do this. So we'll have one level of conflict which is essentially of the nature of a revolt, and I think that will take the form, probably essentially, of something that looks a bit like Northern Ireland, or maybe Italy's years of lead, or a dirty war of that type, which is chronic, low level, relatively targeted in its in the forms of violence. When I mean relatively targeted, I don't expect mass violence, but violence which is specifically directed at particular actors selected for some informational or strategic effect. So opinion formers, political figures, other senior members of the civil service, probably judiciary. And of course, then you do get a response from this. You may well get you'll certainly get a reaction of the state, which will cause things to escalate. Right, once and you may indeed get an overreaction of the state. I think that is quite likely, given the degree of expressed competence of our current state, is that they will overreact. So there's that level of conflict. The other level of conflict is interethnic, essentially, and that has the potential to be that's a much larger conflict, in the sense that it involves much larger numbers of people, and that form of conflict is the form of conflict which that is likely to take, I think, will be essentially violence which is directed at causing assortative movement, basically causing people to demix or create in a kind of pre-Yugoslavia model of causing formerly integrated populations to physically separate into warring neighborhoods, and then those neighborhoods make war on each other, largely through siege conducted by paramilitaries directing their efforts at logistical networks, food supply, electrical supply, and the like, with the government essentially being in a reactive role on account of a number of factors, but one being the inability of a post-national government to call on national unity because they lack the credibility to make those sorts of claims on people's hearts and minds. The second thing being the sheer physical capacity of the state, which is very denuded at this point. The police, both the security services overall, are very much not up to this task. So that conflict will take on a kind of quality of multiple sieges of non-contiguous ethnic enclaves, with a view to making life so intolerable within those enclaves that the people there voluntarily move. That picture that I've described of Britain is pretty, I think actually it's pretty obvious, and it doesn't take too much effort to work out the sorts of places where this will occur. I would suggest if you draw a line east-west across the country from north of the Humber to the other coast, you have more or less one of these zones effectively mapped out. The area the area within the M25 of London is another that's fairly or there are fractions of the area within the M25 are likely also to take on this character. But we could look at other countries and find the same thing, particularly France. And I suspect also Spain is in this position. Well, I'll halt there, but I do think it would be interesting. So my thesis is that this isn't a specifically British issue, that the underlying factors that I've just described are apparent across a range of countries, and they don't differ very much fundamentally within Western Europe. I think the United States is also in the frame, but the picture is different in the United States, and that might be worth talking through, for example.
Yeah, well, let's talk internationally. I mean, I think, are we thinking that Britain is at higher risk than other European countries?
I think it's a very near race. I mean, look, if you wanted to get a mental image of this, think of the Olympic, think of an Olympic 100-meter track event, where you've got 8 runners at the elite level. Look at the finish line there. I mean, there are microseconds in between the winner of this race and between the first and the last. So there's not a lot of difference. I would suggest the race, if we can call it that, is a very close one. I do think, and perhaps on account of being in Britain, I do have a higher sensitivity perhaps to the peril that is faced here, and a kind of more granular appreciation of the basically the pattern of events. But there's no doubt that France is also very close, and I'm given from I'm given to understand from my communications with people in France who are also tracking these events that they feel that the situation is extremely perilous, and maybe they are in the lead. But if I was really forced to say who I think is in pole position in this dismal race, frankly, I think it's Ireland at this point. And that's because all of the conditions that I've just described are very obvious there. But it's also within and to some extent even in a more exaggerated state. But at the same time, this is a country that has a more recent experience and tradition of civil conflict and of resistance. There are people around who know how to do these things, who have experience of it. There are presumably networks and stockpiles, for example, that could be involved. So, I suppose I would probably go with Ireland, though I would just finally conclude on the point of this, is that once it kicks off in any place, there is a very high likelihood that it will transmit to neighboring places. One of the most significant factors in any calculation of the likelihood of civil conflict emerging in any one place is whether or not there is a civil war in a neighboring country. It tends to be one of the, perhaps the dominant predictor, in fact. So I think there's a high likelihood if it kicks off in any of those places, whether it's France or Britain, Ireland, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, that it will propagate to places.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I guess we could add something else. That Northern Ireland or Ireland, right, is it's a result. Those two countries or polities, they're the result of a civil war. So if we count the violence of the 1920s as a civil war, which most people I think do, civil war, recent civil war is a risk factor for future civil war. And in European terms, the 1920s civil war is a very recent civil war. To me, and there's a proximity bias. To me, Britain is experiencing those things more than any other European state. Are we? Tell me how I'm wrong. What is? I don't see similar levels of vigilantism or distrust in France. I've seen a bit of it in Ireland. Are we seeing attacks on government assets like speed cameras in Ireland?
Cameras, no. That's a manifestation of this issue that is specific to the UK on account of the ULEZ traffic system in London. But as far as attacks on more generally with respect to other countries, we can see instances of this. Perhaps one of the instances that I thought was most interesting and indicative was the cyber attack on the Paris Olympics. And the simultaneous attack on the French transport infrastructure around the same time, which were by all accounts now understood to essentially have been politically motivated, organized attacks on infrastructure with a view to producing political effect in the midst of one of the world's great public media events. So I think those attacks I would put into the same category as the ULEZ attacks by the Blade Runners. More generally, though, I think I do urge people when they think about these issues to worry less, or it comes down to how one understands insurgency, right? So if you understand insurgency as essentially a social movement, like any other social movement, that uses almost all of the same techniques, except for it also uses violence, or it goes beyond the law, to use Nelson Mandela's phrase. The important thing to pay attention here is not the beyond the law bit. Really, the important thing, where all the energy is in the movement. And here, I think what is happening quite recently in the UK now, or it's been happening for a long time, but it's now becoming very, very obvious, particularly in recent days, with essentially the nationwide emergence of this raise the flag movement, which is a grassroots, essentially leaderless, kind of almost autonomic reaction on the part of basically the British, the native British population, to the decades-long campaign of deracination and denationalization. And what's happening, and I think that's very significant, because you can see the scale. So if you go on to raise the flag, you can see they're doing this essentially all over the country. There isn't a major center, even a smaller one, where there isn't some sort of activity going on. It's self-directed. But this is also a group of people who are now becoming aware of each other. A movement has to mobilize resources. It has to build networks of like-minded people. And that is now occurring within the native British community, within a range of these grassroots movements or sub movements. And what we're seeing in effect, I think, is this is not the beginning stage. This is kind of the mid stage of political organization. And we're already at an advanced stage with respect to the construction of a strategic narrative around essentially a native revolt, which has as its core the displacement idea. And so, yes, there are blips, there are bits where you can see that people are becoming angrier. They are getting more and more belligerent with police, for example, for whom levels of respect have simply plummeted now. And you're seeing, you mentioned vigilantism. It's maybe a bit extreme term to apply to some of these community security groups, which are, these people, they're not out lynching people, but you do have kind of normal citizens going onto the street in high-vis vests at night in groups, policing their neighborhoods, and doing so and saying they are doing so explicitly because they feel that the state has failed them, that the police are not performing this role. So you see these things starting to happen, but really what's important, I feel, is the political organization and the networking that is going on below the surface, and the cascading sense of awareness of now, essentially millions of people, that this problem that they have themselves felt, often for a very long time, but not spoken about, can now be spoken about, and that causes a cascading effect. This is all really built into the triumph of identity politics. We were ultimately going to get here, and everybody understands that under the identity politics system, that the game was over at the point where the white majority simply accepted the rules of identity politics. and began to behave in the same manner as every other identity group does. So, which is why you could see this coming in theory from 10 years distance, and in fact, further back for people smarter than me. But now it's just plainly obvious to everyone, essentially.
Yeah. So, David, I'm with you on the cascading effect. Mike, you know, you're British. You like me. You're abroad. How do you see it? Are you seeing the same things that David's seeing?
In terms of my view of Britain, yes, I am. I share the same sort of sensibilities as you do, Bruce, and I'd like to make some comments about what you've both remarked upon. What you said Bruce, in terms of how far down the road Britain is, towards civil war, or which country, would be the most likely to ignite along those lines. I'm just going to put a thesis out there, and again, I'm just proffering it as a thought experiment, which is that Britain, England has historically been something of a thought leader, or a collective sort of, it has this, its population has demonstrated a consistent ability to be part of the first wave, or part of the first, the first kind of manifestation of particular social trends. So, for example, England was one of the first, if not the first, to undergo the Protestant Reformation. It was the first country to encounter the Industrial Revolution. It was certainly one of the first to adopt genuine forms of parliamentary democracy, and it was the first, certainly in the European context, to demonstrate a degree of antipathy towards the so-called European project, hence paving the way for the Brexit referendum. And we might posit that, insofar as what David has just sort of said, I think he sort of hits the nail on the head in terms of the ultimate outcome of identity politics. This is where Britain might also be, another exemplar, which is it has the first, it will be the first, potentially the first to go down this route and to reconstitute itself after the conflagration along the lines of a new kind of ordered society, along whatever lines that happens to take. And I'd also, again, I've just put that out there for people to sort of think about. But the other thing, just to sort of quickly add on, it was, from my vantage point here in Australia, it was very interesting to witness the raise the flag, these sort of raise the flag happenings in England, because it does very much point to the reference of Northern Ireland, which is somewhere which I am very familiar with, having done my early sort of research studies on Northern Ireland, and so you can instantly see parallels there. And indeed, it was this sort of initial kind of understanding of what an actual war over identity, and indeed, if you want to call it that, a culture war, where it can actually lead. It was something that, as a result of this sort of prior engagement with the Northern Ireland crisis, which has provided me with the basis for for an interest in this general topic which we're discussing, and to a degree also sort of subsequently fueled my particular interest in insurgency and counterinsurgency, which brought David and I initially together as well. So in terms of our writing, a couple of writing projects that we did together. We do have other examples of state breakdown and state failure. We have, multiple examples, and we could say that we are in various stages of, going through what, for example, Argentina might have gone through, from the 1920s through to the 1970s, which resulted in dirty war. So, or you could say that we're experiencing the South Africanization of Britain's politics, or the Zimbabweification, or the Latin Americanization. But ultimately, it does point to what I think David's comments and reflections are pointing towards, which is Balkanization, and all of the fractiousness that goes with it. Because with some of these other societies, somewhere like Argentina, what was one of the most what could be said to be one of the differences between somewhere like Argentina and the UK is in its current form, is that Argentina is comprised of has a predominant sort of ethnic makeup, and which makes the society, at least at some level, cohesive. Whereas the preference for identity politics and for incoherent multiculturalism and out of control migration is actually steering Britain much more towards the I think even more dangerous path of Balkanization. And again, all of us, will understand what happened in the former Yugoslavia, and this would suggest that maybe that's our long-term fate, at least at some level, in terms of what David is describing, in terms of the way that populations are demixed and ultimately will come into confrontation with each other.
So let's talk about this process by which we could get from state failure to things like Balkanization, and also something like apartheid. So Mike, you just mentioned South Africa as a comparative case. There are Britons talking about living in a form of apartheid, given two-tier justice that seems to be based on ethnicity. So the majority white population increasingly feels that they are discriminated against, and they're certainly not getting some of the privileges that illegal migrants are getting, free hotels and free entertainment, free services in those hotels. So let's try to clarify this process, because I think this is where we can be more theoretical than most commentators on state failure, civil war, insurgency, etc. So I've thought about it, written about it publicly in terms of failure. Britain is failing, right? Its capacities to do the things the state traditionally does, such as control its borders, police its streets, provide justice. It's not doing those things anymore. It's failing right now in those senses. And then eventually it fails, and it just loses control entirely of at least of certain parts of its own territory. And then, we get to things like Balkanization, where parts of the country split off, or they self-govern, or they're at least competing claimants to governance in those areas. And then things like apartheid. And then, as David has mentioned, the idea that there could be geographical separation within the state of Britain, North versus South. I've heard David talk elsewhere about rural versus urban. Right. What do we think is going to happen next? So just in order, let's go David and then Mike. What's going to happen next?
Well, I'll be honest. I don't know. How can you know? Uh, my perspective is that of a professor of war studies. Once you tip into war, then you're in the realm of chance and of escalation. And I think it would, and my sense is it's foolish to try to predict with any specificity where those two constant elements of war will take us once we go over the edge. My hope is that it occurs quickly. The best that can be hoped is that it's short. So you have so I'm sort of reluctant to be specific in prediction because there's so many, the chances are so varied, and people are just extremely creative when it comes to committing violence on each other and the consequences that flow from that. Generally speaking, I think we can say a few things. I think or predict a few things. One is that the geography will start out very complicated because of essentially the demographics of population distribution, but it will become less complicated as the conflict progresses. Secondly, I think that the nature of the second sort of conflict I talked about, the interethnic one, will revolve around these relatively small number of effectively besieged enclaves, and that is that's the parallels with the Balkans or other places are pretty obvious in that. That is not a sustainable situation. I don't think that's going to be a permanent situation. It will ultimately be resolved. Does it take a year, 5 years, 10 years? I don't know how much. But thirdly, we can say that the longer this lasts, the more violence, the more death, the more damage, and the harder it will be to return to a state of normal civil order. To make a long story short, I think that we are heading into this. We will have a period of extreme turmoil. Hopefully it can be limited, but it will take a generation or maybe two to put things back together. And I think those are reasonable statements on the basis of, say, looking at the post-Yugoslav states, for example, or indeed of looking at Ireland. It takes a very, very long time to recover from the damage caused in any war, and civil wars on account of their intimacy and the miasmic quality of the violence in civil wars, I think tend to cause injuries that take even longer to heal. In fact, one of the things about a lot of civil war situations is that effectively they become chronic. They become more or less permanent. That would be simply tragic for Britain as a historical entity to have 2,000 years more or less of continuous history and to expire in that particularly degrading way. But it is a potential there. I do hope for some, so I hope that doesn't occur. But let's be realistic that it is a potential. Certainly, what's on offer at the moment is, in terms of our grand political bargain, is that is that the British people are supposed to kind of voluntarily agree to be extinct. And I don't think they'll go along with that. I mean, extinguished as a national culture, as a national historical entity. And bottom line is, I don't think that they'll go along with it. And that's what we're seeing in terms of the episodes we described earlier. As far as the trigger goes, I've said many times that that's impossible to predict what the specific trigger will be. But I don't doubt that high on the apprehensions of the government and generally of almost everyone in the country who's paying attention is the looming fiscal crisis in the country. Essentially, you can make an otherwise crippled social model work more or less if you can afford to paper over the cracks in society with money, to pay people off, to keep people, from going at each other as they might otherwise do if you have the money to keep people distracted by material comfort, keep them in their homes, keep them well fed, keep them entertained, keep them so on and so forth. I'm not an economist, but I don't think it's a controversial statement that on current trajectory, the ability of the British government and of the governments of many other Western countries to continue to do this is very likely to go over the edge and pretty quickly. So I would think that that's probably a serious crunch point that is looming pretty closely now.
Yeah. All right, Mike. So I think we're focusing on the Balkanization model. What would you add?
Yeah, well, of course, David speaks a lot of sense right across the board there, and I would echo his beginning premise, which is that it is inherently difficult to be speculative about this in terms of what is likely to happen, and that when you get into the realms of an actual violent contestation, the whole process of escalation is always likely to be inherent, and that is likely to take any conflict off into all sorts of potential directions which we just cannot foretell. What I would perhaps add is that one of the questions that it can be debated is, and I think this will be the line which will be taken by those who would wish to be somewhat more optimistic than we are at the moment, would be that the British polity, in terms of what I was saying right at the outset, has this sort of indefinable capacity to absorb and recontain and reconfigure oppositional problems or deal with crises in its sort of like consensus orientated fashion. I would say that to me, and David and I have, we initially did our writings on this kind of area. The British state, to my mind, has lost that capacity, or has certainly had that capacity eroded, as a result of the intrusion of identity politics, as a result of, I think, adherence to extreme sort of liberal ideology, which seeks to cast people in terms of victims and oppressors and all that kind of stuff. And that ability to potentially recontain crises through political reconfiguration through electoral processes is being lost, and I think that does portend quite badly. I think the other thing I would add, and again, I just raised this as a question for people who are listening to this can think about. I mean, one of the questions which also is often raised in this particular circumstances where we're thinking about what has happened to Britain, this once very, very stable, very liberal democratic state, very venerable political tradition, full of inherent moderation and this capacity to work out compromises, and as a result producing a very high trust society. Where has it all gone wrong, with this, with deep intercommunal anxiety, trust in state institutions collapsing, public services not functioning at all well, if at all. How did it all come to this? And this is one of the things that you might want to think about, which is to what extent has this been an example of just folly and hubris and people overreaching themselves, particularly the elites and their adherents to this sort of multicultural sort of delusional sort of ideas about how everyone can ultimately you can port however many people you like from whatever many different backgrounds, and somehow they're all going to end up in these sort of nice tolerant, almost with these traditionally English and British characteristics of moderation and a tendency to muddle through, against what is sometimes suggested has been a deliberate sort of undermining of those very principles of the British state, in terms of the ideological push to destroy what has been up to this point a pretty functioning, and I would argue fairly admirable, political condition, which has seen people work out their differences, and it's not always been easy, and it's not always been peaceful, but generally this has been the orientation of British political life for a good couple of 100 years. That seems to have been gone. Whether it's going as a result of accident or design is something that it might be worth exploring.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of comments on two themes there, and I'll be quick, and I'll be interested if it stimulates anything further from you both. First of all, on the Balkanization, one of the implications of Balkanization, but particularly Yugoslavia in the 1990s, was the flip of consensus from initially thinking that Yugoslavia's got to stay together. The solution to the civil war was to make sure that Yugoslavia stays homogenous, that we recognize the sovereignty, the traditional sovereignty of Yugoslavia, and even to go along with Serbia, the Serbian intent to hold Yugoslavia together as a Serbian-dominated federation. And then that flipped eventually to the realization that it needs to be Balkanized, right? You remember early in the 90s in that war, everyone said, let's not Balkanize the Balkans, right? And then there's a realization that the solution to this war is to actually let the constituent states of the federation to become independent, and then we satisfy these nationalisms and we end the war. Now, the implication for somewhere like Britain is that Britain balkanizes into separate states, maybe nation states. Maybe we end up seeing Scottish nationalism satisfied, and that might be an easy transition because that push has been ebbing and flowing for a while. But then, as David considers, there may be unprecedented geographical boundaries, like north of the Humber, south of the Humber, the southeast around London versus the rest of the country. Maybe there are ethnic enclaves that have no traditional geographical precedent in Britain at all. So I think I don't take any pleasure in thinking about these implications or mapping out these contingencies, everything we're talking about is, I think, at least tragic, if not horrific. But I'm just going to put that out there. The implication of a Balkanization scenario for Britain is that it breaks up. It breaks up into new polities. Maybe they're not even polities that the other polities within Britain want to recognize. So I'll be interested to hear how you respond to that. And then let me just put this out there too, because Mike, it's the second time you've brought up the Britain's lack of capacity to do the things it traditionally was known to do well, such as resolving conflict through liberal democracy, having a common British identity, even while it recognized very diverse regional identities. It was a high trust society, even where Britain's traditionally complained a lot about their politics. They still had high trust in the delivery of their services and stuff like that. Now, I'm going to add this. I warned in the 2000s when a lot of people were talking about how a lot of Americans, I was already working in America, a lot of Americans would point to Britain for its flexibility of constitution. That's how they used to talk about it in that decade. There was some jealousy that whereas the United States has a written constitution, and there's all sorts of vagaries and disputes about what the written constitution means, Britain has a more flexible constitution where the government can escape the disputes about what the founders' text actually means by talking a lot about precedents and having the flexibility to interpret precedents without getting into a constitutional court talking about what the founders actually meant, right? So there was a lot of jealousy in the 2000s from Americans that Britain had a flexible constitution. But as I warned at the time, the danger of a flexible constitution is that the government can abuse it. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is a few decades, in fact, is a government that increasingly is doing what it wants. And it is easy to abuse free speech. It's easy to get into two-tier justice. It's easy to abuse human rights if you do not have a single constitutional text which spells out in propositions what our rights are. And instead, British law traditionally relies too much on case law, in my opinion, and too much on precedent and not enough on statute. And the British government has exploited this in order to act in more authoritarian, anti-democratic and independent and secretive covert ways. So two things for you there, the implications of balkanization and then the implications of a flexible constitution. What do you think? David, let's start with David since we're going in that order.
Okay, well, I have a few thoughts on that. Firstly, I think that it's important to recognize that the country isn't what it was. It was fundamentally transformed by the Blair government in his first administration. And that was a project taken up fairly enthusiastically and openly by the Conservatives under Cameron, and in fact carrying on throughout the whole of the 14 years of the Tory governance. But I think many of the things you describe about the qualities of British government and of British society cease to apply by the 2000s. Blair government said it was very open about its intent to fundamentally transform the country through migration, and to use migration, essentially population change, as a measure by which the arguments of the right would be permanently defeated by effectively changing the nature of the electorate, and they accomplished that. There's no doubt about it. That was deliberate. It was openly stated. and it has been accomplished. There have been a number of other changes basically in the way in which British governments operated that are associated with that or parallel with that. I don't want to kind of overextend my competence as a political scientist. I do have a degree in political science, but it's not really my area. But I think it is. But I would say, from my point of view, the issue here is essentially that Parliament is not really sovereign. It's very apparent that the British, well, let's call it the deep state. I mean, deep state is probably a fair a description of it that most people would recognize, is fully able to control the government. They can make or break ministers if they wish. They can slow policy changes. The British bureaucracy seems to have not seems, I don't mean to be wishy-washy about this. The British bureaucracy has developed a self-conception that essentially ministers, elected governments, are simply one of a range of stakeholders whose views need to be taken account of. That's a complete inversion of that. That's not the way things are supposed to work. I mean, people expect that they will elect a government, and that government will enact things that are the democratically expressed will of a majority of the people. But that isn't the way the country operates, and it hasn't operated that way certainly since the Blair era. And that's not tenable, right? I don't think. And in fact, one could say that in effect, the 2016 Brexit vote was a referendum was in essence a referendum on this idea, where the people said, look, we want our national government to govern in the national interest, to behave as national political leaders. 9 years later, what we have is successive governments of both parties, effectively of the uniparty, that have serially refused to take on this role. They're not interested in. They feel kind of restricted by the idea of national government. They're resentful of the people who are telling them that they should act as national political leaders. So that's my kind of whatever. That's my sense of the larger political, legal, constitutional space, for what it's worth, as a war studies person and not as a constitutionalist. Secondly, turning to the Balkanization issue, I'm very sympathetic to the argument that what we're headed towards is something like Balkanization, but I at the same time, I'm a bit cautious about this, because essentially what I'm describing, this is not a Scots versus English versus Welsh issue. There is another issue, of course, about British identity and the compatibility of British identity with the historic national identities that are a part of that. I don't think that's what's driving us to civil conflict. Really, what we're talking about here is a really much more recent intrusion of a non-British minority that right, and as this is different from the Balkans. I mean, the Croats had been occupying that bit of the Balkans and have their own continuous history of occupation and of that place, going back over many, many centuries. There's no doubt that the Croats basically are native to that bit of the former Yugoslavia. Likewise, the Serbs and indeed the Bosnians had their own centuries-long history of in this place. This is not the case with the non-native minority in the UK, and that I think is important to bear in mind when we think about how this is going to when we speculate on the likely shape of things to come. My strong sense is that Balkanization is a step towards essentially the ex-migration of large numbers of people, that there will be significant population movements from Britain and from many other Western countries. The question is how rapid and how violent that might be. The third point I would just remark upon, thinking again about the Balkans. There was a survey done in 1990 in pre-Civil War Yugoslavia, which really preoccupies me, because in this survey, which was conducted across the country, people were asked whether they got along with their neighbors of differing ethnicity, and would they rank their relationships with people as being very good, poor, or very poor. And 90% of respondents in 1990 ranked it as either very good or good. 3 years later, the same people were kidnapping each other's children and drilling their kneecaps out and the like. People need to understand how quickly events can unfold in these kinds of situations. That the normalcy bias that exists, that affects most people, that says to them, well, that inclines them to say things like, well, I have good relations with my neighbor, I don't have any issues with this. That can change very, very rapidly, and there's nothing congenitally different about Britons or Yugoslavs in respect of this, would be my thesis, that this country also, the people of this country also have the same human tendencies to react under certain conditions in a very volatile manner, in ways that, looking back, they themselves could hardly comprehend that they could change so very, very rapidly. So that's essentially what I would add.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you, David. And I think I would be surprised if 90% of Britons would say that they trust their neighbors today. And even if they do, it's not going to capture. I mean, that's not a survey question that I would expect to be particularly valid. It would not capture the general hostility you get, say, walking through London, where some people just don't want to serve you. They don't want to serve you even if it's good for their business. They want to serve you based on ethnicity, and it's not just anti-white, it's between different immigrant communities. The hostility is palpable. It's almost like walking through a state that's already failed in some of these cities, the big cities, London, Birmingham. Anyway, Mike, what you got?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of hopefully quick add-ons. Again, David has covered a lot of the territory very well. On the question of balkanization, yeah, and would agree with you, Bruce. It's sort of quite interesting to ponder that, when the Ohio Peace Accords came along and NATO patted itself on the back as being one of the NATO actions were seen as being in part responsible for bringing the conflict to its conclusion. Actually, the real conclusion was exactly as you said, was that the reason the Ohio Accords happened was because Balkanization and ethno-religious separation had already taken place, and that was the basis for the settlement. And so this raises the question, I guess, which is to what extent, and I'm not, I use these words advisedly, that is not only is Balkanization inevitable, but to what extent should it actually be welcomed as the solution? Yeah, and as a consequence, if we feel that Britain is heading towards complete state failure, then is something along those lines, or whatever the British equivalent is, is it something that ultimately provides the reconfiguration of the system in a way that secures people's identities in whatever format it is? So is Balkanization something necessarily to be disdained, or whatever the variant is, is in the British sense? Yeah, and so again, I think sort of David has kind of covered pretty much everything that I was going to mention in response to your last question, which is in terms of Britain's or the British policy's state capacity to resolve problems. Yeah, it's a lot of that fundamental sort of flexibility that you talked about with not having a written constitution and parliamentary sovereignty is that the British elite has outsourced its sovereignty to either international institutions or international legal regimes, which have at least nominally at least prevented it from tackling very urgent problems. And so governments of both persuasions have accepted that sort of outcome, and don't seem to possess any sort of real impetus in terms of the two currently existing major political parties, don't seem to possess any real impetus to change anything, certainly not radically enough to actually make any kind of difference. And so that simply portends even more potential conflict, which is actually going to manifest itself at some point down the line. As David says, we're basically dealing with very fundamental issues of human nature. Yeah, and human nature is always going to reassert itself at some point down the line. And that's so it is. We're seeing with English identity. We've been talking about the flag issue, which is ultimately, this may be just one precursor, to something much more visceral, if things don't change. But as we know, the British state has changed in fundamentally radical ways, where it can't actually provide any sort of solution anymore. And so, I think that the verities of political life, Hobbes 101, is going to reassert itself. In the words of Rudyard Kipling, the gods of the copybook headings with terror and slaughter will return.
Let's focus on those comparisons. So, David, you're a Canadian in Britain. What's going on in Canada that parallels what we've been talking about in Britain in particular?
Well, look, you put me on the spot because, yes, I am Canadian. I do have a Canadian passport, but I haven't lived in Canada since effectively the middle of the 1990s. Although I visit regularly, I don't want to suggest that I'm expert on the Canadian political scene, because I'm simply not. I haven't lived there in a long time, and I kind of dip into it. But that said, there is, I think, a certain value in sampling a particular case at on a semi-regular basis rather than a regular basis, because you can sense the trajectory of events maybe a little bit better. I think that everything that we've discussed certainly applies to Canada, and in some respects more. I mean, the volume of migration to Canada has been very, very great. I think it's probably, if it's exceeded by any of the countries we've discussed already, it's possibly only Ireland. So there's been an enormous change in the Canadian demographic profile just over the last, not just over the last 10 years, but in fact, going back further. It's a radically transformed country, and I think that most expat Canadians who travel regularly back to the semi-regularly back to the country would have observed over the last couple of decades that every time you go back, it looks less and less like it did. It feels less and less like it once did. Now, of course, I mean, all countries change, and why should it be exactly the same as one expected? You might come back on that point, but I would suggest that it's been very, very dramatic and very obvious in Canada that essentially it is. So it has all of the same issues that we've been discussing. I think the key difference, or not a difference, or the key parameter that strikes me about Canada, or maybe two things that are worth remarking on now, given that long caveat about the extent of my knowledge of Canada, is first that Canada's had an identity crisis since its founding. It's always been in a kind of state of permanent. It had always been in a kind of semi-permanent state or permanent state of semi-identity crisis, which it had largely solved by the kind of paradox by suggesting that Canada was a kind of the two solitudes, the English, the French, with and the native population. There was a kind of paradoxical quality to Canadian identity, and that it has had for a very long time, and that Canadian identity crisis, in my personal experience, practically exhausted the country already by the early 1990s. After the country had gone through a series of constitutional crises surrounding its identity, and people were simply exhausted. I think the political system was exhausted, and the society was exhausted by the discussion, which made them very vulnerable. Which made that society very vulnerable to a very pernicious, now very obviously pernicious suggestion, which was that, well, we'll solve this by not having any identity at all. Canada will become the first post-national, or the first post-national state, as Trudeau II declared early on in his first premiership. As a signal quality of Canada was that nobody could define what Canada was. It was just this kind of amoeboid collection of semi-disconnected elements. And so in short, Canada has all of the same problems, and in some ways it has the problem in a very severe way of having to express in an identity conflict what it is about. The other thing I would mention about Canada is very obvious when you think about it, but maybe people might not think about, is it's a very cold country. Now, I've already described that I think that the nature of the character of the conflict that is coming is likely to be one that is focused on essentially system disruption, with a view to causing essentially cascading failures in the cities, which would make them essentially intolerable to live in. That's a very plausible strategy in throughout the whole of the Western world, but it's especially plausible in Canada because Canada has a climate which actively wants to kill human beings for somewhere between 4 and 6 months of the year. If the power supply goes off in for a lengthy period of time, say in a city like Toronto, where much of the metropolitan population lives in apartment buildings now that are heated electrically. People will start lighting fires in their homes in order to warm themselves. So I think that that bit of the Canadian climate and its hostility to human life for certain periods of the year is likely to be a distinctive element of societal breakdown in the Canadian context, because it has the potential to massively exaggerate the effectiveness of infrastructural attack. Also, the cities, moreover, are more widely separated. So it's as everyone knows, it's a very large country. It is a very urbanized country, but those urban centers are separated by very long transportation networks, which are actually vulnerable under normal conditions, let alone when people living outside of those cities are incentivized to break those, to disrupt and or to break those urban life support systems.
Thank you, David. All right, Mike, give us the comparison with Australia.
Well, so, I mean, my reading of the Australian sort of polity and the social developments, touching on what we've already mentioned, is that Australia is certainly not immune to many of these trends. You certainly can observe problems such as the ideological capture of institutions, certainly the universities, I think, being amongst them, a preference for clamping down on forms of speech which are seen as unacceptable. You have what you might sort of describe as uni-party politics as well. That said, I think that of all of the countries that we're considering, I think Australia is the least advanced down the path along some of these trends that we have been describing. And I'd point to a number of instances where Australia is radically different in terms of its outlook and its approach on certain issues in comparison to the UK and to an extent Canada, I suspect. First of all, it's very tough on migration. It is very difficult to get into the country, and that's not just because of its relative geographical isolation. It is extremely difficult to get residential status here. You have to jump through all sorts of hoops. It's not easy to get in at all. And they're unbelievably tough, relatively speaking, on illegal migration. If you turn up on a boat or in some other fashion and you're entering the country illegally, you'll be shipped offshore. You'll never be given citizenship, and you'll never get any prerequisites from the Australian state. And that is broadly endorsed by both political parties, and that's a very, very strong difference that I think you see from all the countries that we're thinking about. And to that extent, that also functions very much as a point of unity, within the populace, broadly speaking. Obviously, it's an enormous territory, relatively small population in relation to how large it is, but it also has very strong independent states, in many ways far more autonomous than the American states, and so that is one of the things that I think allows the Australian polity to just keep itself going in a way that actually reflects different regional sensibilities and identities. You have these very distinct 6 Australian states, which act as the repository of whatever local identity and sensibilities there are. You also have Australia's very distinctive sort of political and electoral mechanisms, such as compulsory voting, which actually means that parties can't play to the base. So in the end, although there might be a sort of this rather soggy uniparty, nevertheless it means that the main political contenders for power can't actually really diverge too much from what the general spirit of the population wishes. So it can't do a UK very easily, which is just outsource all of its sovereign powers to sort of some other state or some other set of institutions. And I think a combination of those things actually produces, again, not wishing to be complacent, because I think there are counter trends, absolutely, but generally that seems to maintain, for the time being, a sense of relatively strong national cohesiveness in terms of, certainly in comparison to the USA, or well, certainly with Canada, and I think increasingly Britain. And I think perhaps the most obvious thing which mitigates against Australia going the same way is that they can see the way things are going elsewhere, and they can see, particularly because there is a strong sense of connection with the United Kingdom, and you have the living example, the living embodiment of what happens when incompetent elites or malign elites let things get out of hand. And I think that may be the single biggest factor which actually prevents Australia from going in the direction that we see in places like Canada and Britain.
Yeah, great. Thank you both, because you've given me a lot of comparisons that I can now make with America. So first of all, I'd say one obvious thing, I think America is more fiscally robust than Britain. It runs a very high public debt, like Britain, but I have more confidence in both the political system and the mood of the country to control that than I do in Britain. I mean, the current government is just is unable to cut spending, and it's unable to cut the debt, and that is it's probably hiding its debt, and it's already on an unsustainable path. I doubt that Britain can actually solve its public debt crisis. So I think the US is more fiscally robust at the federal level. There are certainly bankrupt cities. That's been a long-running problem. And it's not to say that the US government, the federal government, doesn't need to cut its liabilities. It certainly does need to do that. But I just have more confidence that the US government can do that. And I'll make another point. Tariffs are adding an awful lot of revenue to the federal government at this time. So it's doing pretty well this year. Now, I'll draw a parallel with Australia. So Mike mentioned Australia is tough on immigration. America is tough on immigration again, right? So Trump said we're going to make America tough on immigration again. That's not going to fit on his red baseball cap, but that is clearly helped with public safety. It's a very strong contrast with Britain. It is popular. In a way, the Joe Biden administration demonstrated the extremes to which a progressive administration could go with open borders, tolerance of crime by unvetted illegal immigrants just let loose. The reporting of illegal immigrant crime was much more robust in America than it has been in Britain, where British authorities have used the courts to suppress the facts of immigrant crime for too long. We had a much freer press in America. It was harder for the Biden administration to hide from these facts. And it's a major reason why Trump was elected to a second term last year, 2024. There is a resurgent national identity in America, which we are seeing in Britain, but not in an official way. That's the comparison I want to make. So the federal government, the Trump administration, is making an issue of national identity. You see it in the Department of Defense under Pete Hegseth, the idea that we're going to make America proud again. We're going to reward our personnel for putting America first. You don't see that in the British government. The British government under Keir Starmer is still talking about getting Britain back integrated into the European Union. We definitely have privileges for illegal immigrants that Britons do not have. We definitely have two-tier justice, not just in privileging illegal immigrants, such as covering up their crimes, but also certain ethnicities which are British citizens, but they're getting away with tweets that white Britons get jailed for. Right, we have a resurgence of patriotism in America, which is official at the official level that we're not seeing in Britain. I'll also say that in America, we're seeing the decline of identity politics. There are plenty of commentators that say wokeism is dead. They don't mean it's completely dead, but it's certainly in decline. We may say it's not necessarily the end of wokeism, but it's the beginning of the end. And I'll say this is also an official trend because the federal government is using federal funds to punish universities and cities for being woke, for having policies that are in contradistinction to federal policies, such as sanctuary cities that refuse to cooperate with federal authorities on enforcing border control and on enforcing in rounding up illegal immigrants. And federal funds are being used to punish universities like Harvard that have discriminatory policies against certain ethnicities, particularly Asians, in their admissions process. So, and then the next thing I'll mention is having said all of those trends towards a more homogenous United States of America, we still have political separatism. We certainly have political separatism. So there's still a great political partisan divide that manifests very clearly geographically. So California, for instance, versus Texas, both large states, well, the two largest states in the United States, they have high immigration, but immigration of different political bias. So California attracts more leftist immigrants. Texas attracts more rightist immigrants. Those trends may not be sustainable, but we certainly have Americans choosing their localities based on politics. Now, there's another form of evidence for this political self-segregation by geography, and that is the movements towards state separation from the United States. So there's been a long-running campaign for Calexit, and there is actually a campaign for Texit as well. And generally, the motivations are a little different. So Calexit tends to be a leftist wish to separate from a federal government that they regard as too rightist and too warlike, not too uncaring. And then the Texit movement tends to be more a separation from a federal government, which they saw, particularly under Joe Biden, as too interventionist in state rights, taking too much money out of states and spending it not in the state's interests. So those movements continue. So I still see Americans self-segregating by party, by political party, and that is a problem. But it's different. It's different to Britain, where I think at least currently, the sense of disaggregation is more ethnic and more and the political segregation is in terms of is a rebellion or a revolt against the two-tier justice by ethnicity and by citizenship. I think the self-segregation in America is more partisan. I'll just make that point. Now, having said that, there is ethnic segregation, and that does have a lot of parallels with Britain. So take communities in America, say in a place like Minnesota, where for whatever reason, some cities have taken an awful lot of refugees, asylum seekers from certain ethnicities, and those ethnicities have created enclaves in effect, and that has affected politics, where you get similar ethnic-based politics in a place like Minnesota that you do in Tower Hamlets and other municipalities in Britain that are run by second-generation immigrants whose loyalties seem to be to the country of their ancestors instead of to Britain. So we have mayors of cities in Britain that care more about using British funding to fund airports in Pakistan than they do in Britain. And similarly, we're seeing some of that. We've seen it for a long time, where we have United States senators flying the Palestinian flag outside of their offices, and they're constantly talking about the Palestinians, but they're not talking about their constituencies. So I think that is true across all Western countries. It is certainly true in America. Now, I think I'll make this interesting parallel with Canada and Australia, which is the geographic distribution of the urban areas. There are some places in America, the northeast seaboard, the southwest seaboard, which are highly urbanized, so urbanized that cities blend into cities. They're just incredibly urbanized, and the infrastructure is good. The infrastructure tends to be overloaded on those seaboards by population, but the infrastructure is good by comparison with most countries. However, there are parts of America, particularly the middle states, where the distribution of urbanization is vast, and the infrastructure in between is poor. Or if it's not poor, it is few and far between, and the natural barriers are very great. Mountains, forests, rivers, lakes, enormous lakes. So yes, like Canada and Australia, in an extreme case where a country is breaking up, there are going to be isolated urban pockets and isolated rural populations, isolated they're going to be less privileged than urban areas in emergency response. That is true even without a political crisis. That's true where the natural disaster hits, and it's difficult for the best of emergency managers to get resources to those places because they're just remote. The infrastructure is few and far between. Now, additionally, America, like Canada and Australia, has some very high natural risks. We have earthquakes, we have very severe tropical storms, we have frequent wildfires. We have a lot of natural disasters, and those can put a strain on any country. The United States traditionally has been a high capacity country for responding to natural risks, but you can imagine during a political crisis where capacity is low or stretched, natural disasters could add shocks upon shocks, and that could lead to certain political recrimination. Right, and then finally, I think Mike brought up a good point about how the Australian political system, by making voting mandatory, helps to keep parties away from just playing to their base. Now, America is an interesting case because it's often criticized for its primary system, where primaries are generally only open to a single party, so registered voters within a single party. However, increasingly states have changed their rules so that you don't have to you don't have to be pre-registered with that party in order to vote in that primary. You can change party on the day of the vote, or even in some states, voters from either registered party can vote in another party's primary. Right. So the playing to the base during primaries, that has weakened. It still goes on. It is a problem. But I'll say about the American system, which I think is unique, is that we have so many elections, it is hard for parties to avoid popular will. And I'll make that comparison with Britain in particular, where it's been very easy for national government in particular, but also local government, to just ignore popular will, because there just isn't as much accountability through elections. Right? In Britain, we have a general election where pretty much you have a single vote and it counts at every echelon of government. And then you don't have you very rarely have direct democracy like the 2016 referendum, whereas in the American system, you routinely have referenda, dozens of them on a state ballot at every general election. So it's hard for American politicians to ignore popular will, which is one of the reasons I have more confidence in the American system's ability to adapt than I do in Britain. And Britain I think of the British politics these days as entirely elitist, almost entirely elitist, even at the local level. There are counties like Dorset County, where I most recently lived. Dorset County is a conservative county. It routinely elects conservative members of parliament, but its institutions are all woke. Its schools, its police forces, its services. It's one of the reasons why Bournemouth, the resort town of Bournemouth, is now a criminal hellhole and is being patrolled by vigilantes. So that is not possible in America. You cannot get such imbalances between what the people want in that constituency and what the politicians deliver in that same constituency. So lots of parallels there. Thank you for stimulating them. Great discussion, Mike, Dave. Anything final you want to add, given our international comparisons there?
I think that America. I obviously think that America is a different case than those of Western Europe, and you've pointed out a bunch of them. But another one I think is that the issue that very strongly at issue in the Western European context with respect to migration, at the center here is the indigestibility of the Muslim population, which is different, a different factor than that in the United States, and gives things a different tenor. The other thing, though, that hasn't been mentioned with respect to the United States, and where I think the volatility or an element of volatility in the situation with respect to the United States, is that the America's fortunes are are tied very directly to larger developments in the shape of the international system. It's by no means a sure thing, but it is certainly a possibility that in relatively short time, we will see dramatic changes in that. So questions, for example, around the American dollar as the reserve currency, or other things with respect to America's position in the international system that allows certain domestic arrangements that allows essentially the American economy to function in the way that it has done, to spend at the rate that it has done, could change quite dramatically. And if that was, and if that were to occur, I think that the potential knock-on effects on American stability could be extremely dramatic indeed. I'm very influenced in that respect by reading the work of the American financier Ray Dalio, who particularly is interested in economic cycles and of the dominance of reserve currencies and the effects on reserve currency powers when they lose that status, as it is plausible the United States might do at some point, potentially relatively soon. Certainly, we talk about the BRICS now in a way that would have been weird in terms of their potential just 3 or 4 years ago. Now it seems a much more plausible thing than it did recently. Another factor which I think is fairly obvious but hasn't been mentioned is that it's a very violent country. How many assassination attempts have there been on Trump now? Is he going to survive the presidency? You don't know that Trump doesn't get a bullet through the head tomorrow. It could happen. One missed his brain case by a fraction of an inch just a year ago, right? So there is that strong potential. What happens if you wake up tomorrow and the reformer has had his brains blown out? That's happened to American presidents on television before. By the way, not within my lifetime, but within the lifetime of many people. So there is a volatility, a potential volatility to the political situation in America, which I think is unavoidable. And I do wonder, at the what happens if you do get a successful assassination of Trump, or he simply dies in office, because after all, he's a 79-year-old man. And the people in line are, I mean, when it comes down to it, I think Trump is kind of the classic American country club sentimentalist. The people that are likely to come after him are or rather more radical. I think certainly Vance is politically more radical than Trump is. So, I think there in the American case, it just strikes me that there are a couple of potential factors, both economic and political, such as I just described, which have the potential to act on that society like a grenade in a coffee can. It's going to go bang in a big way.
Yeah, I take all of that, David. I think those are very good points. I hadn't thought about them. I'll just say quickly that I still would have more confidence in America, the American system responding to an assassination. I think in the short term, and just talk about this administration right now, I think it's got a lot of depth. So I don't think there would be a particularly traumatic succession if Trump were to be incapacitated in office. And then, irrespective of this administration, the rules of succession are much clearer in America than they are in Britain, where in Britain we see prime ministers coming into office without a popular election. It's just an internal party struggle, and it's often not even democratic within the party, and that can create recriminations. And often those internal party selections turn out to be disastrous, including Theresa May, and if not Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss. So yeah, I take your point. it's relative, right? I still have more confidence in the American system. Mike, quickly, anything
I'll
we
just
didn't mention?
yeah. Yeah, I'll just finish very quickly. I know David has to sort of shoot off very soon. Except to say, yeah, I mean, I think you know, in terms of reflecting on the very on the differences between Australia, the US, Canada, and the UK, I think it just simply highlights how differing political traditions affect the outlook of various states, you know. And I think you're right, Bruce, to sort of kind of draw attention to the fact that, you know, the way that the British political system is set up and has operated for some time now is still imbricated in sort of elite class consciousness. And I think that that is one of the reasons which does explain its current parlous condition. But in the end, and I'll finish on this, you know, macro observation, just to reconnect to something I said earlier, which is that what we're seeing in certainly somewhere like the UK, more generally Europe and possibly Canada as well, is that ultimately, you know, all these issues which are building up as a result of you know, deluded multicultural policies and you know, economic debt and, you know, all those sorts of things, which, as you say, Bruce, seem to be at least being ameliorated in the United States. I think it just sort of underlines that you can't escape political reality, and that political realities, or any kind of realities, are going to reassert themselves. You know, and you can't escape the sort of ancient sort of tradition or traditions which extend from ancient times, which have shown that this is the way things, societies, economic systems generally work, you know. And I think that's what societies like the UK and certainly in other parts of Europe have actually sought to do, which is try to transcend reality. But reality will always come back and bite you in the end.
Well said, sir. I thank you both. I really enjoyed this.